in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah in source number 1. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said, Imru lufanai b'Rosh Hashanah malchios zichronos v'shofros. Hashem says you should say in front of me, and that's the concept of the verses that we say in the Musaf, the additional prayer of Rosh Hashanah, verses having to do with God's sovereignty, zichronos, remembrance, and shofros, the shofar blast. And the Gemara tells us, malchios kedei shetamlichuni alechem, the verses of sovereignty so you should make me your king. Zichronos kedei shialeh zichronchem lefanai l'tova, remembrance so that your remembrance should rise up before me for your benefit. Ubameh, and through what? Through the shofar. So clearly, the three major motifs of Rosh Hashanah, as the Gemara outlines for us, it's Malchios Hashem, God's kingship, Zichronos, the remembrance, and Shofros, the shofar blast. I'd like to Yirtz Hashem today focus primarily on the middle of the three, on Zichronos, on the remembrance. And I'd like to raise a number of very, very fundamental questions, and then Yirtz Hashem to take a look very briefly at three approaches, albeit of many, to respond to some of these questions. When we're talking about Zichronos, remembrance, it's clear from the Gemara that we should say these verses so that the remembrance should be before me for your benefit. What does that mean, that the remembrance should be for our benefit? If God is going to remember, then there are many things that He may remember that aren't going to be for our benefit. What is the whole concept that Zichronos is for our benefit? And now obviously, as the Rinas Chaim points out at the end of 2, Hashem wants us to be judged favorably on Rosh Hashanah and gives us precious advice. And needless to say, though, the recital of Zichronos cannot be superficial. It must be Imru Lefanai. There must be in front of Hashem a real, genuine saying of these verses, so that there's a power in these verses to be able to be Latova for our benefit. And the question is, what does this mean? How is this done? The second question we need to understand is the interrelationship between Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. I can understand that God is king over us. But what is the relationship between God and making Hashem king over us and Zichronos and the remembrance should be for the good? And how does that tie in to the Shofros, to the blowing of the shofar? That's our second question. Our third question, which I think is probably the most fundamental question, and this is the question we're going to focus in on of the four, it's a question that Rav Meiselish points out in Imru Lefanai Malchios, and he says, V'chi ech efshar in source 3, shayach lapei shmaya musag hazeh shel haskarat davar. Hold on a second. When we're talking about remembrances that God remembers, so the obvious question is, how do we understand that there's even such a concept by a Kadosh Baruch Hu of God remembering? Halo ein shicha lifnei kisei kvodo. God never forgets. V'chol hamusagim shel zikaron davar shenishkach lo shayach la v'klal atzlo. When we're talking about remembering, forgetting, these are very human terms. God never forgets. So when I say verses of remembrance, so that God should remember us for the good, well, God never forgets. So what is the whole concept of remembrance and remembrance on Rosh Hashanah all about? And the final question, which is a question Rav Pinkus asks in his Sefer Mamorim and Elul, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he says in source 4, Rosh Hashanah im kain hu yom nora. Rosh Hashanah is a very awesome day. Mitzad achad pachad shel din. On the one hand, there's a fear, there's a trepidation of the judgment. Umitzad sheni, on the other hand, there's a simcha shel din. There's a certain joy in the day, right? We eat, we're merry, we don't fast on Rosh Hashanah. Michan pacha mizikaron. On the one hand, we're afraid of the remembrance, because the zikaron is the din atzmo. The remembrance seems to be the judgment itself. Umeidach simcha, but on the other hand, there's a joy, as it seems from the Gemara, she'aleh zichronenu l'tova, that our remembrance is being brought up for the good. So on the one hand, the fact that Hashem remembers our deeds, that's pretty scary. But yet it seems from the Gemara that this remembrance is positive. How do we deal with this double theme, almost the contradictory theme of the Yom Norah, the awesome day, and at the same time, the Simcha of the day? The idea that it will be Zichronenu L'Tovah, that our remembrance will be for the good. So I think to try to be able to get a handle on what this is all about, I'd like to try to understand, Mirz Hashem, 3 different approaches that we have to the whole idea of Zichronos, the whole idea of what Rosh Hashanah is about, and hopefully ideas that we can integrate into our own lives as Rosh Hashanah is quickly approaching. Before we begin to analyze these 3 levels, I'd just like to outline very briefly, to make sure we're all on the same page, what the Gemara is referring to by Imru Lefanai. The setup, the structure of the Musaf